I was on one of those ships you're looking at. Part of the biggest show on Earth and didn't know it. Too darn many ships to see all at once. Well, we've been hollering for action. Now we were going to get it. But we didn't know where. Norway, France, Italy, China. Finally, on the 5th day, we got the news. I mean, what we'd been waiting to hear. They handed out little guidebooks. And I remember the first line. You are to do duty in North Africa as a soldier of the United States. Gave me kind of a kick.
Why North Africa? What was the plan called Acrobat? The convoy from America was heading east, the one from Britain heading south. At a given point west of Gibraltar, the British convoy would divide. For 12 hours, the two halves would proceed in opposite directions. Then the second half would reverse its course and follow the first, passing Gibraltar 24 hours behind. Thus, with clock-like precision, the combined operations would begin with simultaneous landings at Casablanca, Oran, Algiers. Casablanca to protect our flank against an Axis attack through Spanish Morocco. Oran and Algiers to secure bases from which to press eastward. Then the occupation of Tunisia, from which we could cut Rommel's supply lines across the Mediterranean. Next, to trap and destroy Rommel's Africa Corps between our allied forces and the British 8th Army.
Thus, one arm of the Axis pincer would be amputated, and supply lines round the Cape of Good Hope would be shortened by half through winning control of the Mediterranean. North Africa would be ours, with bases from which to stab at the heart of the Axis citadel. Those were the main objectives of the plan called Acrobat.
All right, so I'll kick it over to Don Miller, and we'll be underway with our historians.
Welcome, everyone. Hope you didn't have too rocky a mission last night. This is an exciting cruise for all of us. I first came up with the idea for this cruise 3.5 years ago, Nathan, or 4? And brainstormed with Nathan. We presented it to Nick Mueller, and he approved it and got it through the board of directors. And then the question became, how do we get a boat and hold it and get enough passengers to fill it? So that's one mission accomplished. And thanks largely to the advanced scouting, incredible advanced scouting by Nathan, our Magellan over there. And so here we are. Now, you've seen the film. We could actually go back to breakfast right now. That kind of sums it all up. That does the job. We're going to come back to this graphic in a little bit because I want to try to, with the help of my colleagues, frame the war and what's going on November 8th, 1942. In the Pacific, what's going on in the rest of Europe? How did we get to this situation where we're invading the Mediterranean and North Africa? The big question, they put it this way, why Operation Torch? Our question is, why the Mediterranean? And it's often considered an insignificant theater, a preliminary theater for the American forces to get their feet under them and learn how to fight. It's the first time the Americans engaged directly with the feared and seemingly at the time invincible German army, and it's a proving grounds. The best thing I've read on this idea of learning how to fight are the Ernie Pyle's articles, and he's writing for the general public. So a lot of Americans at the time know that we're in trouble in North Africa. And at the same time, out in the Pacific, John Hersey and is writing similar articles, and we're in trouble in Guadalcanal. Richard Tregaskis has already left Guadalcanal and published a piece in Life magazine, which you read between the lines, right, Rich, and it doesn't look too good. So you want to think about this. This is a war that could have been lost. And Usually when when professors give lectures and things like this, a lot of times you drift into what I call determinism, where you already know the outcome, so that your entire lecture, your entire book is driven by the idea of how we won or how we lost, pointing out the pivotal points along the way. How did the Confederacy lose? How did the North win? Well, that's history by hindsight, and history is supposed to give you perspective. That's what we're taught. But I think there's such a thing called the fallacy of perspective, and that is that if you look at the war like that, everything seems inevitable, and nothing is inevitable. When you walk out of this hall at the end of the lecture, you don't know what's going to happen to you, the ship, your life, anything. And neither do these kids on these ships. As historians, I've noticed reading Mike's book, Rich's book, what we try to do is get behind the eyes of the combatants and see the world the way they saw it at the point just before important decisions are made. Looking into a future that is completely, impossible to predict. Okay. So we want to try to end that kind of, introduce the idea of indeterminacy, some chaos and things like that, and a kind of an unnatural order to the war. So this is a messy thing, and even on this cruise, we're going to be bouncing around a little bit chronologically, back to the Spanish Civil War, for example, in *36. Today we're in 42. So in a couple of minutes, we're going to try to explain this map or this graphic that I reproduced. And I'll have Rich talk about the Pacific and Mike talk about Europe and how we got to the point of November 8th and where we are in the war. So hopefully that'll give you a framing for what's to come. Now, just a couple of things by way of introduction. On one of those ships that you saw there, headed for Iran, was my Uncle John. He was with the 1st Division, the big red one. He was 18 years old. He was a Slovak son of a steel worker from Reading, Pennsylvania. And he had no idea what to expect. He was told there would be possible French resistance. This confused him. I talked to him quite a bit about the war later. He was like a second father to me. He's now passed, God bless him. But my great-grandfather and his great-grandfather had fought in World War I with the French to save France from the Germans. Now the French are going to fire on us? What's this all about? And that's the thing. They weren't told much at all about, what Vichy was. They had no idea. And they found it that an anxiety-producing dilemma. So he lands, and he begins 640 days of combat. Fights through Algeria, into Tunis, off to Sicily in Operation Husky. Then they transported the 1st Division along with other troops, stripped Sicily up to England to prepare for the invasion. He was in the first wave at Normandy, fought into Belgium and Germany, fought through the Hurtgen Forest, fought and was wounded in the Bocage in France, fought and was wounded again in the Hurtgen Forest, finally crossed the Rhine and was captured by the Germans. And that was his war. And unfortunately, a lot of the guys didn't make that. In his landing boat, the 18 guys in his landing boat, he was the only one to survive the war. So if you fought at the spear, in the front lines, and very few American combat troops did fight like the bloody 100th, almost incessantly at the front. This was your war, and it was an awful thing. Now, I asked him one time what he thought of the idea of the greatest generation. Was he part of that? He dismissed that, sarcastically actually. We had an uncle of mine who served with my Uncle John, who was our next door neighbor, and he was he took his last breath in the inside of a tank. He was boiled alive in a burning tank. I said to my uncle, it must have been tough to take Francis's death. And John said, it was, but what made it especially difficult was that we didn't know what we were fighting for. I thought we should be out there killing Japs, and Francis did too. And I said, was Francis part of the greatest generation? He said, no, he was just a kid that got killed. And only later did a lot of these guys who survived learn what this war was all about when they finally confront the German army, and especially in the Hurkut Forest, and even more so at the Bulge, when there were massacres like Malmedy, when the SS was an active force, when young Hitler youth, fanatical Hitler youth were in the struggle. They could see that, and my uncle could also see it in the POW camp he was in. So they did come to know what the war was about, and they did learn, that it was worth fighting for. So it's not a question of not knowing what's going on, and having no idea what's coming, and versus the idea that the greatest generation just mobilizes and knows we're going to fight for democracy, knows we're going to crush fascism from the very beginning. It's a little bit of a dialectic. So what we're going to do is we're going to first begin with that framing of the war that I described. But I asked our panelists, and we're all going to do this, to say a few words about themselves. Because what strikes me, it struck me as a college student. I'd sit there and I'd listen to a lecture, and there was one guy in particular at the little Benedictine college I went to that turned my life around. And I kept thinking to myself, yeah, he's a good lecturer, but who is this guy that's transmitting this information? Who the hell is he? I don't need to know what time he gets up in the morning or how many kids he has, but how did he come to history? And how did he make history a vocation? I needed to understand that. And what kind of history was he teaching? I learned after 2 or 3 weeks what kind of history he was teaching, but I wanted to know why he was teaching that kind of history. He taught entirely by the Socratic method. He taught almost entirely through biography. I'd never had been exposed to an approach like that. So knowing something about the lectures is very important. And I noticed that on some trips, by the 3rd or 4th day, people didn't know really who we were. And Rich and I found that on the Rhine, and defined it by engaging with the guests. So Rich, and I've also asked Rich and Mike to talk a little bit also, not just about themselves and what they've done, their books, but what drew them to history. And so Rich?
Well, it's the old story from my route to this. I fell in with evil companions. I was born in Leavenworth, Kansas. My father, all the males that we knew, my uncles, had served in World War II. Grew up on Victory at Sea and watching documentaries like that. And because it was in the middle of the Cold War, my expectations were that I'd go to college, be the first person in my family to go to college, be in the service, one of the branches of service, and then I already had sort of this life plan by the time I was about 13, being a lawyer. And then eventually I was already very interested in history from late 5th, 6th grade. And the determining moment I always remember is my father took me to the Carnegie Public Library in Leavenworth, Kansas. The building is still there. You walked in through these art columns, and on the right side, one twilight evening, the new books were up on the shelves over the right side, which were considerably above my cruising level at that time. And I saw a blue book with a gold trim on the spine, and it said Léty. And it was one of Samuel Eliot Morrison's famous naval histories. My father was kind enough to pull it down, and I really became really hooked at that point. There's something about being from Kansas, the vast expanse of the oceans of the Pacific and far distances or whatever here seem a little different from, getting waving wheat in your face all the time. And my ambition was to go to the Naval Academy in Annapolis or whatever here, but my eyesight guaranteed that I was not up to Navy standards. I filed that away, and when I wrote my first book about Guadalcanal, I settled accounts with the Naval Academy. And I got him good. So I served in Vietnam. For part of the tour, I was an aero rifle platoon leader with the 101st and Air Cavalry Troop. And that's been an invaluable experience because phrases like fog of war, firepower superiority, things like that, I have a little first-hand experience in what it's like to stand on even a small battlefield with the dead, what the reality of it all is. So I came out, went to law school, and I was pretty much trundling along my life plan until I decided I wasn't really totally happy with my job. And one night I was reading another book about World War II, and I slammed the book shut and I said to myself, I can do better than this. And that was the genesis of my first book, What I Can Now, which, working part-time and full-time job, only took me 10 years to turn out. 2 years to find a publisher, which was quite an experience in itself because they tell you you have to have an agent to get a publisher, but you can't get an agent until you've been published, so you have to figure out how to navigate that. So I finished that, that was published in 1990, and I was extraordinarily fortunate that I fell in with Random House and an editor called Robert Loomis, who was one of the great American editors of the 20th century. And he did both fiction and nonfiction. Among his authors were William Styron and a number of other luminaries you hear about. So I did that book, and then I was fishing around for a second book, and then Bob guided me to, do a book about the end of the Pacific War, which was my second book, Downfall. That only took 7 years because I only had to change path once. And then I did a short biography of Douglas MacArthur. It was a Palgrave the Great General series, they called it, but we had a disagreement. They wanted me to do a great general, but I wanted to do General MacArthur. So they let me go ahead and do General MacArthur. And then I'm working now on a trilogy on the whole Asia-Pacific War, of which the first volume, Power of Skulls, was published in March of 2020, just in time for COVID. So the most happy experiences of my life was Don got Nick Mueller to recruit me for the work for the museum, and it's been an incredible experience. I was the chief historian for the Victory in the Pacific, the Road to Tokyo exhibit at the museum. So that's my story.
Morning, everybody. I'm Michael Neiberg. I'm a professor of history at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And because of that, my dear friends in the Post-Judge Advocate Office would like me to tell you two things. The first is, I am not here as an official representative of the United States government. I'm here on vacation. And the second is, anything you hear me say in the duration of this cruise is the expressed opinion of me and me alone. It does not represent the U.S. Army War College or U.S. government policy in any way. The Public Affairs Office would like me to tell you, please not to tweet or put anything on Facebook that I say here with my name attached to it unless you clear it with me first. Now that that's out of the way. To be honest, the only thing that I can think of that got me into this, I had as a professor at the University of Michigan a wonderful prince of a human being named John Shy, whose class I would not have taken but for an automobile accident that delayed my registering for classes. John gave me back a paper of mine that said, A, please see me. And I remember going to a friend of mine and saying, I understand F, please see me. I don't understand what A, please see me can be. And we went through all sorts of scenarios. Maybe he thought I had plagiarized something. I was terrified. And John sat me down and said, what are you going to do when you graduate from Michigan? And I said, I don't have a clue. I'm thinking about a bartender's license till I figure it out. And he said, I think you ought to go to graduate school. And I said, sir, I don't know what graduate school is. And he did the coolest thing a professor has ever done. He said, I'm taking you out for a beer and I'm going to explain it to you. So every Sunday at the Society for Military History annual conference, until he passed away, I bought John breakfast, because if he hadn't had that act of kindness, I might be bartending. I make a good old fashioned. I went to graduate school for a PhD. I started working primarily in First World War history, and then got interested in the extension of that into Second World War history. I am trained as an historian of France and the United States, but predominantly France. So that's what kind of led me into those kinds of issues. As all of us here do, when you study military history, you do study 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 sides of an issue. So we're all international historians by training, which is not the norm in our field. So my last book that has been published was on Vichy France, which is this strange political animal that I'll try to explain to you over the next week or so, and the United States' relationship with it. So otherwise I could have been tending bar on the ship, so you never know.
What I like about Mike and Rich as historians is they're specialists, and their books are deeply researched and focused, but they're also generalists and who know a little bit about a lot of things, and which you have to be, I think, to be a good teacher. You know, and although Rich isn't a professor, he's a great teacher. He also teaches courses at the World War II Museum, and is one of our outstanding instructors down there. 1995 was a big year in my life, and a tragic year. It was the year my father died, and I had worshipped my dad. To me, he fought the greatest fight you can ever fight against alcoholism, and he won. And was a very good man the last 22 years of his life. He served in the 8th Air Force in World War II, and I was transfixed by the war because I grew up in a military family in a military neighborhood, an old ethnic community in Reading, Pennsylvania. You know it from the Monopoly board. And you knew where to find us. It was right behind the gas tank in town, this big green gas tank. And my greatest fear in life was that goddamn thing would explode someday. The whole neighborhood. But every man on our block, this little Slovak colony was a 3-block area of Reading, had served in World War II. My uncle flew, you know, in the Pacific, B-29s. Uncle John, you know, in the 1st Division, on and on and on. And my dad was president of the Catholic War Veterans. I'd sneak in there, drink orange sodas, and play the slot machines. And this is so we wouldn't call mom and drag dad out of there. And and we all lived for a while with my grandmother. And I remember one haunting photograph which described the war for me, what it was like on the home front. It's my grandfather, who was not as old as he looked, but he was a white-haired man, a big Slovak immigrant, steel worker, and he's standing with my 3 aunts, and they all had babies, and they all lived in the same house. World War II on the home front was a world of women, and I was born in 1944 during the war, November 11th, 1944, and one of the great discoveries of my life was when my brother and I finally had the guts to, the door was locked, but we picked the lock and went up to the attic. And there were the 3 trunks of my uncles whose wives lived, or all sisters, lived with my grandfather and grandmother during the war. And there were German Lugers and Japanese swords and you name it up there, gas masks, and we were transfixed and we were totally into it. And I watched, loved, Victory at Sea and the whole thing. Then it all went away. I don't know what the hell happened. I got interested in sports. I played football and basketball. I got a scholarship to college. And I never took, in my entire life, a course in military history. Nor did I ever take a course on World War II. And over time, I became a professor. And I was teaching at Cornell at the time, and my dad died. And I thought to myself, where the hell did World War II go? Because I can't understand my dad. I couldn't write his obituary unless I hooked him in to the war, because he was all World War II. He didn't talk about it a lot, but in our community, on Memorial Day, the men marched with their service caps on, and some of them with their uniform blouses, up to the cemetery for the gun salutes and things like that. So it was an ever-present part of our lives, but I thought, I had written at the time, this is 1996 now, I had written 5 books, and they were doing pretty well. I won the National Book Award, I've been nominated for Pulitzer twice. My dad was proud of me, but I never wrote the book he really would have been interested in. on the 8th Air Force or on World War II, because I really didn't know enough about it, and I wasn't curious enough about it. I was interested in the history of ideas, intellectual history, and I wrote books about cities and biography of Lewis Mumford, and missed the boat on the war. So I thought to myself, if I'm going to learn about World War II, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to start teaching it, I'm going to start writing about it. So I wrote a general history of the war called The Story of World War II. All my books are published with Simon & Schuster, and it did okay. And then I published a book on the Pacific after I met Stephen Ambrose. Steve called me one night and said, I was working on a biography of Ulysses Grant for PBS, The American Experience. And Steve said, where are you in that film? I said, we're finished. He said, get me a copy. Do you have the last part of the film? I said, yeah, we do, on Grant's death. Died, of course, of throat cancer while he's writing his autobiography, and finished it just in time before he passed away. And Steve said, can you get it to me fast? And I said, how fast? He said, can you bring it down to the museum tomorrow? I said, what? And I knew something was going on. I got a ticket that night, and I went down to the museum, and he told me he was going to die. And he had incurable cancer. And I remember meeting him and his wife Maura at one of the seminar rooms at the museum, and crushing. I had known Steve from my Simon & Schuster days before he formed the museum, and joined the ride to build the museum. And Steve said, come on, I want to show you something. He took me over to a file cabinet. Now, he had written Band of Brothers. He had written several books on the war, and based mostly on first-hand accounts, soldiers. And here were these two file cabinets filled with memoirs, letters, diaries from Pacific vets who wanted Steve to write their story, just as he had written the story of the European theater, a personalized history of World War II. And he said, I'll never do it, I'll never be able to do it, but I want you to have all this stuff. And we're going to photocopy it for you and ship it to Pennsylvania. And I want you to write a book about the Pacific. And I have one important point to make about it, and that is, call it D-Days in the Pacific. Because I think that's what the Pacific was all about. When I left New Orleans 2 weeks later, my wife was with me. I went to collect the bill. I went to, write the check out for the bill, give him a credit card or whatever. And they said, it's paid for. Extremely generous guy. So I went on to write that, and then I finally wrote the book I wanted to about my father's war, which is the 8th Air Force. And since then, I've made a turn. I've not lost interest in the war. I'm still part of the presidential counselors at the museum. I'm doing a film right now with Steve Spielberg and Tom Hanks, based on a book that I wrote on my dad's war, as it were, although he's not a character, deliberately so, called Masters of the Air. We're in the last stages of production right now. We have 10 episodes filmed, ready to go. Hopefully it'll be out in the fall to follow up to the Pacific and Band of Brothers. It's an enormous $330 million project, the most that's ever been spent on a film or a movie in history. So I've been heavily involved with World War II lately, but mostly with the Civil War. When I go home, I'll be writing about Grant and Lincoln in the last year of the war. And before that, my first Civil War book was on the Battle of Vicksburg. So I guess, I wrote a biography of Lewis Mumford a while ago. He called himself Professor of Things in General. And I guess that's what I am, a kind of professor of things in general. Hopefully in the best sense of the word. So now we'd like to go on, and in another preliminary moment, one that is absolutely directly connected to the war, we want to bring you up to date, go back to that date, November 8th, 1942, the fleet's in the Mediterranean. We're off the coast of Morocco, and why are we in Morocco, by the way? Because our great fear, the Allies' fear, that Hitler will come storming through Spain and Gibraltar and put a cork in that end of the Mediterranean. So that never happened. It's a fantasy. but that's why Patton's there for a while. But I'd like Mike to open up because he takes the war back to an earlier date and has done some. I was really impressed by his book on Vichy. Okay, you start first. Okay. This is typical of classrooms that I teach. I have no idea what I'm going to say until I get there. And one student said to me at World War II Museum on the evaluation, it was a good class, but this guy is a fraud. Because he comes in without notes, he must be making it up. So much for that approach. Yeah, sorry about that, Rich.
That's okay. I think the main thing, and this is spinning off what Don said, it's extremely important now and extremely difficult now for most Americans of later generations now to look back over the charred rubble of Berlin and Tokyo in 1945 and imagine just how dark the war looked up through at least the summer of 1942. And very quickly, I'm going to sketch the Pacific from 31 to 37, then Mike's going to talk about what's going on in Europe. Then I'm going to come back with the run from Pearl Harbor to mid-1942 and just frame up where we are as we're looking to go into North Africa in November 1942. In August 1931, a group of Japanese Imperial Army officers on their own hook initiated a war that seized the provinces that are collectively called Manchuria in China. They did this without any sanction from Tokyo, and they kept doing it even after people in Tokyo were trying to tell them to stop. The Japanese Prime Minister, who was a member of a political party, tried to rein them in. He was assassinated. This was the second Prime Minister who had been assassinated within basically a 2-year span, because just prior to that, a Prime Minister who had signed a naval agreement, the London Naval Treaty in 1930, he was assassinated also for supposedly betraying Japan. What happened at that point was that the end of whatever experience in democracy that Japan had been through in the 1920s ended. There would not be another elected prime minister, member of a political party, for the remainder of the period through 1945. Between 1931 and 1945, Japan went through 13 prime ministers. Most of them would be Imperial Army or Imperial Navy officers. Having seized Manchuria in 1931, which was very much full of resources and industry in China, the Japanese then attempted to subvert Chinese sovereignty further south into the northern provinces of China. Meanwhile, the leader of the China at that time, Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Nationalist Party, which was the dominant party, but you have to understand that Chiang was always effectively the leader of a coalition. It was not simply the nationalists against the communists. It was the nationalists and a host of other leaders, regional leaders, sometimes called warlords, that Chiang was leading. Chiang decided in 1931 very bitterly that China was not in a position to challenge the Japanese, but he believed now to get China's sovereignty restored there would have to be a showdown war with China, and began diligently planning that. We know now there's been a tremendous change in the scholarship we have about what happened in China since about 1985 or so. The most important event was the publication of Chiang's diaries in 2006, which completely changed the perspective on Chiang, not only here but also in the People's Republic of China. Japan in the 1930s was essentially a military state. It was run by the military. Under Japan's Meiji Constitution, the military was not subordinate to the civilian government. It supposedly only answered to the emperor. The Emperor Hirohito, however, presided and did not rule. He did not specifically order anything that was not something that was presented to him as the agreement of the civilian and military advisors. The military government, in turn, was highly factionalized both within the Imperial Army and the Imperial Navy. And moreover, in particularly in the Imperial Army, there's a Japanese saying, the middle ruling the top. Imagine a nation's military and political and foreign policy being made by a bunch of field grade officers, majors, lieutenant colonels, and colonels, the top figureheads steering by what they are directed by these middle grade officers. In 1937, there's one of numerous encounters between Japanese and Chinese soldiers, this time near a place called the Marco Polo Bridge. And at that point, Zhang decides that he's asked for the patience of the Chinese people and the people he needs to retain, in whom he needs to retain their confidence as far as he can go, and he decides that this is going to have to be full-scale war. In 1937, there's a huge battle in Shanghai. It's by far the biggest battle in the city prior to Stalingrad in 1942. Before it's all over, there's 250,000 Japanese, there's 750,000 Chinese soldiers fighting. The Chinese army, the key part of the Chinese army is Zhang's own Central Army, which fights extremely hard, suffers extremely high casualties, particularly among academy trained officers. There's an estimate that in that campaign they lost 70% of their academy trained officers. The Japanese win, and they expect the Chinese to quit. They expect them to quit because for literally almost exactly a century, no Chinese central government had managed to sustain a war against a westernized power since 1839. But Zhang does not quit, nor do the Chinese people quit. Japanese drive on to the nationalist capital, which is Nanjing, where they commit what's now called the Nanjing Massacre, and the Chinese still do not quit. In 1938, there's a tremendous campaign up the Yangtze River focused on the Wuhan cities, which you've probably heard a little bit about more recently. And in that campaign, there's more very large-scale conventional battles, tremendous losses by the Chinese. The Japanese have to use poison gas. They're the only major combatant we know of that use poison gas routinely on the battlefield. And one arm of the Japanese drive on Wuhan used poison gas 370 times by one of the reports. The Japanese eventually will succeed in seizing Wuhan in October 1938. But the Chinese don't quit, and interestingly enough, we now know that in the secret war diary at Imperial General Headquarters, the staff officers write that it's now clear that Japan cannot force China's defeat by military means alone. They're in a quagmire, and that's what they're stuck in. To attempt to intimidate the Chinese, they also embark on wide-scale air raids throughout China. In one span, just in August and September 37, they bombed more than 50 cities. There's a huge campaign against the interior capital, then called Chongqing, now called Chongqing, which goes on particularly in 1940, 1941, where they're literally trying to terror bomb the population into driving the Chinese to surrender. So that's the Asia-Pacific theater up to when Hitler begins to make his most significant moves.
Thanks. Okay, great. Thank you. Merci. What I want to do is lay out for you a little bit of what this weird political animal called Vichy France is and why it matters. And you're going to hear some references to it in Casablanca. You'll pick up on a couple things. Casablanca, of course, was being made as all this was happening, so it's very much in people's minds. In the spring of 1940, May, June of 1940, Germany invaded France through the Ardennes forest. As all of you know, it's about a 6-week land campaign, at the end of which the French government, called the Third Republic, demands an armistice, which they expect will work a little bit like World War I worked. There'll be an armistice followed by a peace conference, and it's important to keep that in mind. The Third Republic then falls apart. A man named Marshal Pétain, a great hero of the First World War, then serving as French ambassador to Spain, comes back in, dissolves the French Third Republic, and cuts this armistice deal with the Germans. What you see in red, the various stages of red here, become occupied France. So the very dark red colors that you see are occupied zones where most French people have to leave. That becomes, in effect, a German military zone. The rest of it, including the city of Paris, and including much of the industrial northeast, also comes inside that occupied zone. Here's the weird part. The rest of France is technically an independent, neutral country called l'État français, the French state. We more commonly know it as Vichy France. So if you were listening to the Lockeries, the Portuguese phrase for their country is the same, Estado Novo, right? This new kind of state, or this French state. The free zone, which is under there in purple and in yellow, please ignore the yellow just for a little while, that's technically an independent country. Pétain becomes its chief of state. It's headquartered in the small spa town of Vichy, which is why it's known as Vichy, France. And again, please keep an eye out as you're watching Casablanca. There's at least 2 or 3 wonderful references to it that you'll miss if you're not looking carefully. So I'll point out a couple of those after we watch it. Here's the key. Vichy is neutral. It's a separate state. And here's the real key if you're an American planner. Vichy controls the French Navy and the entire French Empire. So if you're an American military planner, and the American military planner most worried about this in 1940 is Matthew Ridgway, Ridgway is looking at this and saying, nothing we thought was true 6 weeks ago is true now. Unlike World War I, where the Germans could only get U-boats into the North Sea, or out of Germany really, in one spot. Now, they can move U-boats overland, by train, and set up in the western ports of western France, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and Brest, and put them directly into the Atlantic Ocean. Est-ce que je peux avoir la carte avec l'Empire français? La carte précédente, s'il vous plaît? Merci beaucoup. Parfait. Okay, the other issue, of course, is that all of this is also controlled by Vichy France. And again, I just want to introduce this because it's weird. These 3 places, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, are in 3 different political statuses. Tunisia is a part of the French Empire. Algeria, at least the European parts of it, are technically parts of France. So that Algiers is a French city in the same way that Marseille is a French city. Okay? The expression in France is that the Mediterranean runs through France just like the Seine runs through Paris. Morocco is a protectorate. What that means is France controls its foreign and military policy, but cannot exclude another country from trading in it. It's a very weird situation, as again you'll see in the movie. What the Americans are worried about is not just Casablanca and the ports on the Atlantic Ocean. They are also worried about Dakar, Senegal, which can interfere with any trade going between Latin America and Europe. Everybody with me so far? Because it's going to get weird. Okay, here are the 2 questions the Americans have from the minute that this happens. 1, what kind of political orientation will the government in Vichy have? Pro-German, pro-Allied, or neutral? And what would that neutrality look like? The second question is, what happens if the Italians or the Germans get a hold of the French fleet? The French army is defeated in 1940, but the French fleet is not. What would happen? From this, the United States Department of State concludes, A, as far as we know, legally, technically, the government in Vichy is the legal government of France. The British don't agree with this conclusion, by the way. They feel very differently about this. And therefore, the United States should not only recognize Vichy, it should find the most talented diplomat with military experience that they can find and send him over there as ambassador. And the first guy Roosevelt has in mind for this is John Pershing, who is too ill to do it. So they send Admiral William Leahy. Pershing later sends Leahy a note saying, a much better man has been chosen for this difficult job. I wish you luck. Go get him, sailor. And the United States has to figure out what to do. Now, at the same time, I know many of you know this history, there's another Frenchman who says Vichy is illegal and illegitimate from the start. I recognize none of it. And on June 17, 1940, gets on an airplane with a man named Edward Spears, a pro-French British officer, also a nasty anti-Semite, but that's another story. And that man, Charles de Gaulle, the junior-most general in the French army, hops on a plane, flies to London, and gives his famous speech on the BBC on June 18, 1940, in which he predicts exactly what's about to happen. France has lost a battle, he says. France has not lost a war. France has an empire. France has friends. France has allies. And France is going to win this war with the use of those allies and those friends. At this point, I want to emphasize the United States is not one of those allies. In America's eyes, Charles de Gaulle is nothing more than an angry general, barely promoted general, who has decided that he's now the head of the French government. You don't get to be government head of government simply by standing up and saying, that's what I'd like. There has to be a process somewhere. Right? So a lot of what we're going to talk about over the next few days here is the political complications of Vichy, the military complications of Vichy, and the real open question, if you get rid of Vichy, what the heck do you do then? And I just want to preview for you one thing as we get ready to think about this week. I argue in my book, one of the reasons the United States decided to go into North Africa is exactly because of the fear. Well, two things. One, that the Vichy government was about to collapse, in which case the Germans might take over for no other reason than there's no other form of government there. And two, and I really want to talk about this during the week, although the United States government had recognized Vichy, the American people were appalled at the decision to work with a government that was obviously pro-German. So there was also a fear that if the United States did not demonstrate that it was anti-Vichy, it could cause both military and political problems. And that's why this operation, Franklin Roosevelt initially tried to nudge George Marshall to get him to agree to conduct it before the 1942 elections. To make a demonstration to the American people before they voted that yes, we understand we're anti-Vichy too. Marshall, to his credit, said, Mr. President, we'll do this when I'm ready. You have your calendar, I have mine. But, as I argued in the book, and as I'll argue all week till you're sick of me hearing it, this weird, strange political animal of Vichy France is integral to everything that's going to happen in the Mediterranean. And we still don't know a whole heck of a lot about it. So that's what I'm going to be here to talk to you about this week, although as Rich and Don both said, all three of us are generalists. We'll be bouncing from Burma to Vichy to South America to wherever you need us to go. Thanks.
So let me fill out just exactly how dark the war looked. When Hitler overran Western Europe in stunning 6 weeks, or between April and June 1940, it was like the world had turned upside down. The American strategic position just was totally inverted. We had subcontracted that out to the British and the French. It was a tremendous shock. Congress reacted the way it normally does when there's a big problem. They started throwing oodles of money at it, typically with the Two Ocean Navy Act. Through the middle of 1941, the Axis powers, Germany and Japan, seemed to be invincible. Every battle, it seemed, went their way. In fact, if you line up everything that happens between 1931 and the middle of 1942, there are only two strong rays of hope for the Allied cause, the first of which is the British holding out during the Battle of Britain, the second of which is when the Soviets repulsed the Germans in front of Moscow and other areas on the Eastern Front in December 1941. But both the Battle of Britain and the Soviet repulse of the Germans in 1941, at that point, only looked like reprieves, not deliverances. Then Japan enters the war big time against the U.S. in December 41, believing that they've signed up on the winning side, for which there's good reason to believe in December 1941 that the Axis powers are going to be triumphant. And Japan runs off this incredible run of victories between December 1941 and May of 1942. In that time frame, they create one of the greatest empires in history in only about 5-6 months. It covers 7 time zones. Before they're finished, they have about 516 million people within their empire. At the max, the Germans have about 360. They again have been almost totally triumphant, except for a few isolated episodes all the way through that period, and they appear just as invincible as the Germans do. The only ray of hope that seems pretty strong comes in June 1942 when the U.S. Navy wins the Battle of Midway, off Midway Islands, which effectively checks the Japanese, finally prevents them from invading the Hawaiian Islands, as Admiral Yamamoto wanted to do so, and used its 425,000 population as bargaining chips for negotiating into the war. Just how dark is it? Well, I've been reading the New York Times day by day through the war, and two things I found that I think are strong commentaries on this. The first of which is on June 25th, 1942, the New York Times, which customarily was a pretty strong supporter of the Roosevelt administration, publishes a lead editorial saying that we think now it's time for President Franklin Roosevelt to hand over direction of the war to a uniformed officer or officers to actually conduct the way the war is going to be fought. In early August 1942, the Times publishes the results of a Gallup poll. They asked the American people about their judgment about Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, and 64% of the American public said they didn't think Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill were up to running the war. Someone else should do so. So that's exactly how grim it is. And one other thing I want to touch upon is Dwight Eisenhower was a planner for General George C. Marshall in early 1942. He writes a memo about what he thinks are the 3 essential prerequisites for winning the war. The first of which is keep the British in the war, the second of which is keep the Soviets in the war, and the third of which is to prevent a link-up between Japan and Germany across the Indian Ocean, which of course ties directly into the Mediterranean and the North African coast. So that's globally where we are, and just exactly how dark everything looks when we begin planning for what's going to be called Operation Torch.
You know, to reinforce that popular perception of the war, which was a true perception of the war, the people are asking questions. Why are our Marines on Guadalcanal, wherever the hell that is? Why aren't they in the Pacific? We fought a battle in the Pacific at Bataan. We lost, and an army's captured, and you know there's a lot of wonderment about what happened to them, and every American wants us storming in there with our Navy, our amphibious forces, and taking on the Philippines. Well, we just didn't have the power to go into the Philippines. We went where we thought the Japanese were weakest, and they're asking the same question about this operation. Why aren't we going into Northern Europe, into the heart of the Nazi, the Reich Kingdom? Why the Mediterranean? That seems to be British terrain. What are our interests, economic, diplomatic, military, in this particular theater? And a final point about the indeterminacy of the war and the sense of pessimism, and how the overthrow of France really throws Americans off balance. More than anything else, I think the fall of Paris woke people up. Cocktail parties over, you see it in John O'Hara novels and things like that. And my brother gave me a map one time. He pulled it out of Life magazine, a colored map. It was 1939, and it listed on a map of France all the bomber bases that the Americans were going to establish in France to bomb Nazi Germany. That's where the air war was going to be conducted. That's where air planners were working on. That's gone. And now it's going to be England. And everything was thrown off when France fell. Now, why don't we get into a Q&A and bring the audience into this sort of thing, and questions maybe about, you know, troop morale, things like that. But maybe today, hopefully we can focus a little bit more on the strategy, because although the soldiers didn't know what was going on, the American High Command did. And you got a situation that's doubly dicey here, because General George Marshall, who's running the war, and Eisenhower, who's running this campaign, are against it originally, and fighting with their own, you know, aligned officers to go into directly to England and begin to mount an invasion in 42, early 43 or 44, and they think this is extraneous. Marshall thought the whole war would get pulled down into this theater, and we'd never get into the heart of the Reich. So, and doubly indeterminate, Eisenhower has never fought a battle. He's been entirely a peacetime general, and he's running the thing.
So one final point. Is there anyone here now who's not depressed? Hold your hand. Okay.
But I'll bring the microphone to you.
It gets better.
Yeah, it gets better.
Question, why, when these first 3 landings on November the 8th, I've read that within 3 days we had control of those areas. How were we so successful for the first time in the first invasion within the Mediterranean?
So it's a really complicated answer. I would say there are 2 factors going on. The first is the military forces that are here in Vichy, there's mixed response. So some of these commanders who are there know what's coming, though they don't know the exact time and exact date. General Charles Mast, who's closer to Algiers, knows roughly what the Americans are up to and makes some very courageous decisions to order French air forces grounded, which probably killed Frenchmen, but ended the thing quicker. There's also, and I can talk about it, but I can't get into it, all of it here. There is an incident where a man named Jean-Francois Darlan, who is the head of the entire Vichy French military, the Americans think he's going to be in Vichy. In fact, he's in Algiers when all this happens to visit his sick son, who by coincidence has the exact same strand of polio that Franklin Roosevelt has. And he's an awful, terrible, evil, nasty, bad guy. And the Americans will make a deal with him, whereby he will order the surrender of Vichy forces, and the United States will in turn all of that stuff that's French over to him once American forces pass through it. So at some point, I want to talk about that Darlan deal because it is, at the time it's done, it's maybe the most controversial thing the United States did in the war until the dropping of the atomic bombs. It drives people. I think it's Edward R. Murrow who said, "Are we fighting the Nazis or are we sleeping with them?" It's a hugely controversial event, but those things that come together, and as you'll see in Casablanca too, they'll hint at it, the awareness of many Vichy senior officers that France's future is with the Allies, it's not with the Axis. So as soon as they stop shooting at me, I can stop shooting at them. But as long as the Americans and British are shooting at my guys, I have an obligation as an officer to protect the lives of my people. So it's an incredibly complicated story we'll work through.
And it wasn't all that quick. We were slow getting through Algeria.
Yeah.
There was a lot of tough fighting there, and we got repulsed very, very badly in December of 1942.
But by the Germans, not by the French.
Yeah, by the Germans. Because the object is to get to Tunis, of course, and the Germans can easily come down from Sicily. They control Italy, and with their air, we want to get there in force. The objective is to get into Tunis in force before the Germans do. But they beat us to Tunis, establish air bases there, move in troops, and make the fight there inordinately difficult. Meanwhile, Rommel is being driven across the Libyan desert by Montgomery, and they're going to unite with the American forces. That was the objective in Tunisia.
Just one other point. The fighting that takes place in certain places is very stiff. And most notably, there's a tremendous naval battle off Casablanca where the French Navy, again, the French Navy was not defeated by the Germans. And the French sailors come out and put up a hell of a fight, even though they're terribly outgunned at Casablanca and suffer, their fleet is almost annihilated. There's a French battleship, a modern battleship, which is only partly completed, which is in Casablanca and engages the American fleet. It's shelled successfully by the battleship Massachusetts, which not only knocks out the turret that works on the Jean Bart, it also scores a deadly hit on the French wine store aboard the Jean Bart, shattering French morale.
You brought us up to date on two different theaters, on what was happening in the Pacific in the 30s and early 40s, and then now into the European side of it, including North Africa as Europe. How much strategic, I don't want to say planning, but cooperation was there between the Japanese side and the German side? Were they surprising each other? Did they have an overall plan between them as to when they would meet? What was happening between those two sides of the axis?
I'll describe the great fear and let Rich describe the reason for it. The great fear is, of course, that the Japanese will sweep around through the Indian Ocean, come up the Suez Canal, and unite in the Mediterranean with the Germans, and then move to expel the British from the entire theater. That's the great fear.
The reality during World War II is the Axis powers never managed to conduct the sort of joint alliance that the U.S. and the British, and to a degree we do with the Soviets during World War II. There's a lot of reasons for this, one of which is simply the physical separation. Whereas our leadership's able to get together repeatedly during the war, they never managed to get a major conference together. And they have very sharply divided interests. I mean, the Japanese are interested in the Far East and their empire there. The Germans are, at least initially, interested in, Germany, the world, or whatever here. The one effort that's sort of relevant to this is that in the first months of 1942, after the Germans had been repulsed before Moscow and various places on the Eastern Front, both the German Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy proposed that the Axis join together to do this Indian Ocean link-up, which, as I mentioned, Eisenhower said that's one thing we have to prevent at all costs. And this is presented to Hitler, who recognizes strategically what the significance of this is, but he says, no, we've got to settle up with the Soviet Union first. And then in September 1942, we intercept a diplomatic message in which is relaying the views of Hitler. And at that point, he still thinks that he's going to win at Stalingrad. And he relays a message to the Japanese that, well, as soon as we settle up here with the Soviet Union, we're going to turn back to this link up across the Indian Ocean as our next major strategic objective.
Given that the Germans captured northern France so quickly, 6 weeks or whatever, why did they allow Vichy France to even exist? Did they not consider it a threat? Did they not know which direction they were going? Why?
It's a great question, and the documents in the German archives were destroyed by Dawn's 8th Air Force, so we don't have the primary records. There are three schools of thought, real quick. One is that they thought that the map I showed you was good enough. If you control the capital, you control the coastlines, you control the industry, who cares about the olive growers in the south? You can put enough pressure on them to get food out of there, it doesn't matter. Idea two was that they figured that if you were going to go to a peace conference, you were going to need the support of France in order to win at a peace conference, so give them something. And number three was that the big thing the Germans were afraid of was a civil war inside France. So the best thing to do was just to put the burden of policing most of France's population on the French police. And if you left them some sort of sovereignty, that would be good enough. I think the third is probably the answer. I also think the Germans figured, as they did with Spain, if we want it, we'll just take it later. And much of the discussions they have with Spain about Gibraltar, they're trying to get Spain to do the heavy lifting and take Gibraltar so the Germans can just pluck it from them whenever they want, and the Spanish are pretty clear that they understand that this is what's happening. So we don't have the official German records. My guess is they thought that was good enough. And of course, the war that the Nazis always wanted to fight was in the East, and the nightmare they had from World War I was that they were constantly fighting two fronts. This way, one front is done, and you can go and worry about the other one. And
the only point I'd add here is that, remember, at the point the Germans are doing this, they think they've won, right? They expect the Brits to fold up very shortly, and then they can turn to the east or whatever here. So from their perspective, they have sort of this, what the Japanese later call victory disease, right? They think it's effectively all over.
They don't want to occupy France. If they can get someone else to do that work for them, fine.
Throughout this process, who was watching Russia?
So Russia's, of course, when Germany invades Russia in 1941, this is when the American diplomats in North Africa realize, and the Vichy French diplomats realize too, Germany can't win the war. So the invasion of Operation Barbarossa is actually critically important for what goes on here, because it begins to open a lot of communication doors, secretly, of course, between American agents and Vichy agents, because now they realize Germany's not coming this way. It's not coming into Spain, it's not coming into Morocco, it's not coming into Algeria, it's going to go east. That opens up a lot of possibilities here. The simple answer as far as this goes is that when that happens, it's a tremendous relief to a lot of American officials that are in North Africa. It means that the worst case scenario of Germany controlling the Moroccan coastline is not going to happen.
In the planning of Torch, wasn't there a concern as to what the Spanish were going to do, and particularly with Spanish Morocco down there, and what did our people, our spies, or our State Department, how did they interact with people in Spain to make sure that that was not going to be a problem?
Great question. So this part of Morocco right here, Tangier, was an international zone after World War I. After France fell, Spain took it. So the Americans thought that was great because it meant there was no Spanish secret police set up there. So a lot of the American espionage stuff that we're doing are radio transmissions from Algiers to Tangier into Gibraltar. So when we see Gibraltar tomorrow, one of the key things that Gibraltar is important about, because of the goofy geography of Gibraltar, you can't get radio signals easily from Algiers to Gibraltar. You can, however, get them from Algiers to Oran to Tangier into Gibraltar. So one of the OSS's first big spy missions is to set up these radio transmitters. Ian Fleming is part of it on the British side. Bill Donovan goes over there on the American side to figure out how they're going to do this. So to them, the neutrality of Spain is a gift, because it means they've got a space there where there's no Vichy French and no Gestapo agents watching them. It's just the Spanish secret police who have no networks there to begin with. So that's where they're doing this, and it really is, I think, the first major amateur becomes professional spy operation of World War II for the OSS. It's right there.
In addition, to keep Spain from drifting into belligerency and an alliance with the Nazis, the United States is putting economic pressure on. Spain's torn apart by its civil war, and enormous quantities of wheat are being imported into Spain to feed the population. And Franco fears another revolution, namely a communist revolution, the revolution he fought and won in 1939. So, and the British have more than hinted that if he moves in that direction, they're going to invade the Canary Islands.
Spain literally, as Don said, Spain is literally on near starvation, near famine conditions. So the American ambassador to Spain is actually an historian, a really interesting guy named Carlton Hayes.
Yeah.
And the first half of his memoirs, really, that's what he's talking about. There just isn't enough food in this country. So the idea of Spain launching a war to him is insane. They can't feed themselves, let alone feed an army on campaign. Same thing is true, by the way, in Morocco and in Algeria. One of the main weapons the United States has, because the Nazis are taking Vichy, through Vichy, taking all this food out of Morocco and Algeria. Morocco and Algeria are on near starvation rations. So the big debate in the United States is, do we send food to these places to feed these people? Or do we assume that whatever food goes in is just going to end up in Germany's hands one way or the other? And it's a big debate. And what the Americans do, which is very clever, is they say, we'll let the food come in, but the people that are there to observe where the food goes have to be given diplomatic status as proconsuls. Right? That theoretically means their communications can't be intercepted. They become spies, in effect. The problem is we arrogantly believe that the codes can't be broken, and we're wrong. But the idea is that through this amount of food, we can open up this entire intel network all through North Africa.
A final point here is, getting back, the fear that the Germans will intervene through Spain is very real, and that leads to an important part of the torch planning. The British want to do everything within the Mediterranean, but the Americans insist that we're going to go to Morocco to have access to North Africa that's not dependent upon getting through the Straits of Gibraltar. And there's a big back and forth about that before we finally insist that we're going to do Morocco.
Yeah, there's one other thing here too. In July of 1940, the British, as you know, Churchill ordered an attack on the French fleet here at Mers el-Kabir and killed about 1,200 Frenchmen. So the fear was, if you see these ships coming and they're British, the French are very likely to fire back. So they're worried about this dimension of it too. And some of these British ships actually carried American flags and American crew members to try to alleviate that. But the idea was, if this doesn't work, we're still over here on the other sides of the Straits of Gibraltar. So at least we have Morocco in control direct into the ocean. So it's all really, really complicated stuff.
Could I ask you a quick question, please, sir? You made a comment. You said that as far as Eisenhower, you said that he had never fought a battle. Patton's comment on Eisenhower was that he was a good bridge player. That's his main qualification. What is your opinion of that assessment of Eisenhower and how that related to the war?
Well, I don't know. Patton's clipped remarks about generals. He once remarked that Montgomery was a bad commander because he had a small head. And, so I wouldn't put too much juice into that one about Patton. Eisenhower was a compromiser. I shouldn't put it that way. He was a conciliator, and great diplomatic relations. Overall strategy, battle commander. He didn't have wide respect among the Americans, who were at the point of the spear in the battle. And made some pretty bad decisions. He almost blew this operation. And he worried when it was over that he'd be replaced, he and Clark. And because a lot of things went wrong, especially that march through Algeria and getting blunted, and the Germans taking over Tunisia, causing some very rough, battles in there. And the feeling was originally too that he wasn't very good, although he became very good at logistics, and because logistics are the real key in here. I mean, the winning and losing of this thing, as Mike was talking about off my wheat comment, is oil. The British are not oil starved. The British troops are washing their clothing with oil because oil is more plentiful than water. Because oil has been discovered in Iraq, and there's a pipeline from Iraq to Haifa. Haifa is the Singapore of the Suez Canal district, and the British are just rolling in oil. And the Germans and the Italians, that's the alliance that we're fighting, the Axis, they can't get oil because Germany produces only artificial oil, 90% of it in a place called Ploesti in Romania. But to get that oil to the Reich and into German warships and the Luftwaffe and things, they've got to go up through the Black Sea, they've got to go out through the Straits of Dardanelles, they've got to go across to Italy, and then, back into, if they can, get back into Tunisia. So this is eventually why Rommel folded up. I mean, Rommel, as Rich will tell you, he's great on Rommel. Rommel was bereft of any understanding of logistics, and which made him a very poor general. And he was also a great strategist in global terms, but a horrible tactician in some ways, and even strategically. He began his shortcomings began abundantly evident when this oil thing comes in, and he's not paying enough attention to it, and pretending he's sick and flying back home, leaving the front. Didn't have his heart in this thing, and that was another problem. To a lot of the German high command, they're wondering, why the hell are we down here when things are starting to go bad in November 8th, in Russia. It started to go real bad for the Germans right there, and they needed everything they could get. And here they are, tied into Italy, still tied down in here. And how do you extricate yourself? The story of how Hitler gets involved in here, basically to help Mussolini, to rescue Mussolini because of his ineptitude, is very uncharacteristic of Hitler, don't you think?
I'm not with Hitler, saying something's uncharacteristic is difficult. I mean, he's erratic. He has some insights or whatever here, and other times, it's nuts.
Yeah. This destruction, what we were talking about, of the invincibility of the German arms, is really tied into Rommel, because he was the feared one. We're going to battle with Rommel. You read Life magazine,
right,
kind like that, and the Desert Fox. How are we going to beat him? And one of the things, I just say one thing here. One of the outcomes, to me, of the Mediterranean, and one of the values of going into the Mediterranean, was that the Americans did lose the discussion over where we should go, Northern Europe or the Mediterranean. Marshall and Eisenhower lose that battle, and in losing it, they win. Because had they gone up and taken on the Germans on the Normandy beaches or somewhere in the north, it would have been a horror show for the Allies. We didn't have enough landing craft, we didn't have enough troops, we didn't have enough of a supply chain. And don't forget, when I go to Normandy, I tell people why we win the Battle of the Beaches. What's missing here? What's not on the battlefield? The U-boats aren't here, and the Luftwaffe is not here. Well, the Luftwaffe was there in 42, and the U-boats, the Wolfpacks, were still a threat. And then what would have happened? We'd have to shift the whole war. Probably, I think, Rich, we'd have to shift the American strategy to the Pacific. If this thing, because Hitler's going to be strongly entrenched in France, in the north. Maybe they finish their fortifications properly, and we say, hell, let's just start throwing that money. They're fighting all the time over this. Admiral King's fighting with Bradley and everybody else about where the resources ought to go. This is a resource battle, and always 1/3 goes to the Pacific and 1/3 goes to Western Europe. Just a sidelight. 1/3 of the books published on World War II are on the Pacific, and 2/3 are on Europe.
A question about the when France fell. Excellent book. There's a comment in there about that spoke to the attitude of the people, the population of France, and their attitude towards Britain versus Germany, to the effect that they hated the British more than they hated the Germans. Now, I don't know how broadly that feeling was and how it changed over time after June, July of 40.
Yeah, it's pretty strong in the interwar years. There's a lot of people believing that Britain had put France in a really difficult position in the 20s and 30s by at the end of World War I, sort of promising that we'll be there to protect you against a rise, because Germany after World War I is still bigger than France, it's still more industrial than France, it still has a bigger army than France. France had this complicated network of alliances in World War I, which included Russia. It doesn't have an alliance with the Soviet Union. So the French in the interwar years are constantly saying to the British, you've got to make these guarantees to us. You've got to promise you're going to be there. Britain prevented France from building 4-engine bombers for fear that they might be turned against Britain in a future war. They were no help in some imperial questions that the French needed help on. And the memory of the French at Dunkirk is nothing heroic at all. If you go to Dunkirk today, there's a monument there. But the monument says to the French soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and their allies. And there's no British flag at Dunkirk. So to the French, that's a moment when the British gave up. They gave up the fight and fled. So, and then Mers el-Kabir happens with the killing of 1,200 Frenchmen. The RAF bombed Paris and bombed French cities. The British helped de Gaulle and helped other French groups.
And didn't provide enough planes to the French?
Didn't provide enough planes, all of this stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of anti-British bitterness that lasts, that de Gaulle remembers certainly, that lasts really deep into the war. The people that run Vichy at least make the rhetorical argument that that German and French interests can be reconciled, and that British and French interests cannot be reconciled. I'm not sure how many people below the level of government believe that, especially after, say, 42, 43. But yeah, going to that Dunkirk memorial is the thing that always brings it home, right? You'd think a Dunkirk memorial in France that would have a big statue of Winston Churchill and a big British flag. There's none of that. Because in the French mindset, that's when the British said, okay, France, you're on your own, we quit.
Think of how important Mike's point is, the point he makes in his book, the central point, I think, that the way the American public's seeing this, and he alluded to this, we're lined up with a fascist dictator, and through Vichy, and a fascist client state. And the British are lined up with de Gaulle and Free France. And that is a bad odor to it.
Bad optics.
Yeah, really bad optics.
I'd like to know a little bit more about the French troops that were fighting, their makeup. I mean, were they mainly from Vichy France, or were they from France as a whole? Were they drafted? Were they fighting against their will, and how did that affect the outcome?
Yeah, great question. So the armistice says the number is not going to surprise anybody, that France is allowed to have 100,000 soldiers in its army. That's the same number that France imposes on Germany at the end of World War I. There's a lot of kind of mirroring here. And there is something called an Armistice Commission, which meets at Wiesbaden, which tells the French which troops they can have and where they can have them. Most of the professional French army, the Germans keep in prisoner of war camps, about 1.5 million Frenchmen, which is the big kind of foot on the neck that they have on France. If you want your sons and your husbands back, you need to behave. If you don't, we can make their life miserable in these camps. So most of the troops that are part of the Vichy French army are either troops that were in North Africa already, or they are recruited mostly out of Moroccan and Tunisian, which is a whole nother story because Moroccan and Tunisian nationalism is also rising in this time period. So a lot of these troops are what are called indigènes, which means that they are from North Africa. Their commanders, their officers, some are pro-Vichy because that's the legal government to which they swore their oath of allegiance. Others, like the man we'll talk about, de Lattre de Tassigny, when we talk about Dragoon, are really just waiting for a moment when it makes any sense to break with Vichy, but there's got to be some other alternative. You can't just break with the government and run your own war. There's got to be somebody else, and that somebody else is going to end up being de Gaulle. So the morale of these troops is not uniformly great, though there are some units there that are very highly professional and very good, because the Germans want the Vichy army in North Africa to be very good, because they expect that Britain or the United States is gonna try to come in.
While we're here discussing World War II, the general public out there, of course, is discussing another dictator. And then eventually those discussions kind of end up with the same question that Eisenhower asked when he wanted to get rid of Darlan. And it's in your book, Michael. What was that question?
What was the question Eisenhower
What was
asked?
the question that Eisenhower posed when he wanted to get rid of Darlan?
Yeah, who else do we go to if...
No, his question was, where's a good assassin when you need one?
Okay, well, where's a good assassin when you need one? Yeah. So I'll just say this one more time. I am here on vacation. I'm not speaking as a member of the United States government or the United States Army
We
or
get it,
any
brother.
agency
We get it.
there is. Especially if the U word comes up.
Any comments on why Eisenhower was selected, other than being close to Marshall?
Eisenhower worked for a long time with MacArthur, and he's one of the only guys actually would argue with MacArthur. And they had a strong relationship. And Eisenhower was a staff officer in Washington, shoulder to shoulder with the high command, and he did good staff work. And he was a get-along kind of guy, although he had a hot temper and an explosive temper. But when he came under Marshall's wing and became Marshall's boy, Marshall was pressing him on FDR to take command of this operation. And he had also, been stationed in England and did a pretty good job earlier in the war up there, and a facilitator. And I think that's why he gets the job. And Patton, of course, is furious, about this. Bradley took it with a bomb.
And basically, in retrospect, one of the other things, in Rick Atkinson's book, An Army at Dawn, brings this out very well. North Africa was very much a steep learning curve for Eisenhower. And the supreme gifts that Eisenhower had was to manage an alliance of very disparate interests and very disparate leaders. I always like to think that his tours serving with General MacArthur basically fortified him for dealing with lesser versions like General Patton and Bernard Law Montgomery. So he was prepared from that standpoint. And
his whole staff was British except for Clark.
And he brings Bedell Smith over finally or whatever here. But he integrated, as Don said, that's one of the key things about making the alliance work as a military operation was he insisted on integrated staff, British and Americans, and he would not tolerate anyone using a term of disparagement towards someone of the other nationality. You get sent home real quick that way. A lot of the Brits really liked him. Admiral Cunningham, his naval commander, who was a great admiral, thought very highly of Tedder. Overall, thought very highly of him, dealing with him or whatever here, understanding what his real role was. But he was not a battle captain.
And Marshall knew that Patton was a loose cannon, and he also knew that Eisenhower was willing to stand up to him.
I want time for 2 more questions. We'll come here, and then Len, I'll bring over to you for the last one.
Yeah, I read a couple articles that talked about Operation Torch was a mistake and that we should have gone straight to Sicily. I can understand the tactical aspects of that. The logistical aspects would have been a nightmare. Would you care to comment?
I don't actually think it's either one. I think it's political. I think it's exactly because of what Vichy France is, what the Americans know about it, what the Americans don't know about it. I think played an enormous role in going there. The logistics are obviously much easier to go through Casablanca than they are to get all the way to Gela and Enna where they're going to have to go. But an awful lot of this is political, and where I teach at the Army War College, we must say it every single day. war is an extension of politics. Politics is not an extension of war. Every decision that gets made is a political decision. And that's what's going on here as well.
And for Churchill not to come to Montgomery's rescue in North Africa just when he pinched the tail and you know, at Alaman and it's chasing him. It's a way to finish this business up. And because the British, for them, it's almost all about the canal in Egypt. And they got to have that. And Churchill's thinking in imperial terms. It's a protectorate, Egypt. It's so-called independent, so is the canal. But operationally, the British control the canal. Yeah, they couldn't lose three things here. They couldn't they couldn't lose Gibraltar, they couldn't lose Malta, and they couldn't lose the canal. And that's what the British Navy and Cunningham was tasked to do: hold those three posts, as the British called them, the posts.
We'll go to our final question.
The French army was side by side with the Brits at Dunkirk, if I recall correctly, and were removed from Dunkirk by the Brits. And the impression, I think they then went back to France, all of them. Could you give us some feeling for the loyalties of the French army? Because it's kind of confusing.
Yeah.
There they were side by
That is
side.
It's incredibly confusing. It's astonishingly confusing. So tens of thousands of Frenchmen are evacuated either at Dunkirk or in Western French operations. There is a plan to kind of reform them as a French expeditionary force and bring them back into France. Then when the French government collapses and Vichy asks for an armistice, for those soldiers the war is over. So legally, technically, they have no reason to be in Great Britain. If they stay in Britain, they're actually guilty of treason. The war is over. So there's a small number that stay and become what was once known as Fighting France and then becomes known as the Free French. This is the group that de Gaulle's eventually going to coalesce into something. But for the vast majority, the legal status of the war is that it's over for France. They legally have to come back to France. So they do. Very few of them end up fighting again, and some join the French resistance. As to what they were really thinking in their hearts, it's hard to say. The French have a wonderful word called the attentiste, which means the people who are going to wait for an opportunity. Attendre is the French verb for to wait. So there's nothing we can do about it now. Charles de Gaulle at this point is nothing more than a voice on the radio. Most people have no idea who he is. The government under Pétain is the legal government of France. It's the one that's printing money, providing food, making the mail get delivered. That's the government. So for a lot of people, there is some enthusiastic support of the Vichy government for reasons that I'll talk about at a different roundtable. And there are plenty of people who are thinking, as soon as we get an opportunity to get rid of this, we'll do so. But there's absolutely no chance when the Germans are sitting in Paris and they're holding 1.5 Frenchmen back in prisoner of war camps. You're not going to get rid of Vichy anytime too soon. I hope that answers your question, but it's a fantastic question because we as historians, we would love to find an anonymous survey done in July 1940. Do you support the Vichy regime, right? Those don't exist.
I'll wrap this up by saying two things. I never understood Vichy better than when I read, Mike's book. I mean, the neat thing about it is he comes in on top of a classic for years, a standard work, and betters it, and he does it with great panache and great clarity. And
Pennsylvanians stick together. That's what this is.
Absolutely. And Rich, I never understood China until you could tell he's China now. He's writing his second volume, but that quick review, he dropped about 5 or 6 jewels in there that not many people know about that could be expanded upon in the books. About the coming of the war, the maturation of the struggle, the civil war inside China, especially with Chiang Kai-shek. So, and the third person I'd like to thank is the audience. The questions were terrific. They were absolutely terrific, and they were interlinked, and thank you for your patience.
More to follow.
Don, Mike, Rich, fantastic job. Before everyone runs off, I have just a few housekeeping announcements. If you did not turn in your health declaration form to Ponant, Okay, you get a new form tonight, fill that out. So replace what I was going to say, so thank you, Sarah. You'll have a new form tonight you have to fill off before you get off for your excursions tomorrow. Tomorrow excursions are in Gibraltar. These will be our first excursions off the ship. First excursions off a ship since the onset of the pandemic. So we're going to call you to your meeting rooms. Now there's 2 times tomorrow for the Gibraltar excursions. There's going to be a morning cohort and an afternoon cohort. Your tour will be to the Rock, to the siege tunnels, and then to the newer tunnels that were dug during World War II. Gibraltar is a really fantastic place. We'll have some terrain maps up when we do the program tomorrow evening so you can see the overall view of what you just toured, and when you're inside the Rock, you see the whole outer part of it. So check to make sure that you'll see your excursion ticket, and it will say whether you are a 9 a.m. or you'll report earlier, or whether you're in the afternoon group. And then your specially modified buses will then wind your way up to the Rock to go into the tunnels and then see the monkeys as well. I mean, if you're on the Rock, you're going to see the monkeys there. Maybe they'll steal something from you, who knows. Okay, yes, your excursion tickets, you don't know what I'm talking about, but they'll be in your mailboxes this afternoon. Then that'll be tomorrow. We'll have our lecture here tomorrow, 6:30, after everybody's back on the ship before dinner. And then the program will be a day at sea, and that will be another 10:30 a.m. program if you're looking ahead to make your spa appointments or anything else. So, and once again, we'll see those who couldn't get their spa appointments later. Yeah, quick.
Approximately what time will be passing through the Rock?
I don't know, with the new sailing schedule, I knew what it used to be. I don't know if anybody from Penant is here to know about what time we'll enter the Straits. Okay, yeah. So you're back here at 4 o'clock for Casablanca. We'll find out and see where the ship is in navigation, and we'll let you know about what time we expect to be through the Rock. So if you're planning to do the viewing of Casablanca, back here at 4, and our historians will once again join us, and they'll do a little bit of insight that they saw into Casablanca and go into some of the making of and everything else. So once again, guys, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. See you later on.